The funny thing about Chaplin is that, of course, everybody knows him as the great comedian, the actor, the director, and of course in the 19 teens and 20s, probably the most famous man in the world. But incredibly, most people don't really think of him as a composer as well. His other talents as a director, as an actor, are so immense that people sort of forget that part. When in fact, if you look at an opening of any Chaplin film, it's always either the second or third credit into the film where it says music by Charles Chaplin. I think he took himself very seriously as a musician. Music was a part of his life from the very beginning. His father being a great Irish tenor, his mother being a music hall performer as well. He was surrounded by music, and since he was 5 years old, he was in the theater, and music has always been a big part of his life. I think he wanted to oversee every aspect, including composing. So Chaplin as a composer is a natural element of him as a complete artist. He actually never even learned to read music properly, yet he played the violin, he composed on the violin, he composed on the piano. He knew lots of musicians, and it was the great love of his life. I think it was his aunt, I forget which aunt it was, but the aunt just said that it's too bad that Charlie became an actor, because the world really lost a great composer. I wrote my first silent film score when I was 23 for Pandora's Box. That was in 1985. And subsequently, from that point on, I just composed silent films and accompanied original silent films, working with various orchestras over the years, Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, San Diego Symphony, things like that. In 1998, the Chaplin family called me and knew about my work and said, would you be interested in coming over to Paris and look at the manuscript of Modern Times for possible restoration? So when I flew to Paris, they literally gave me 6 boxes of music that nobody had opened up since 1936. And I had my hands on some original Chaplin documents, which I couldn't believe I was actually living through. Musical score restoration, in terms of silent film, is trying to get it as close to how the director had originally intended it. So what I do, essentially, for each film restoration, of which I've done 10 now for the Chaplins, is really start from measure 1 in the piccolo part to the end, or at least to the end of that passage, and go from piccolo, flute, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, contrabassoon, horns, trumpets, trombones, tubas, percussion, harp, piano, first violin, second violins, violas, cellos, basses. And for those essentially 1 minute or 2 minutes, depending on how long the passage is, look at each individual part and see what changes were made by hand to each one, and then put it all together. And then I've got 1 minute of music after that. But the reason you restore a Chaplin score is because you want to try to do it live. The Chaplin family had, I think, the foresight to be able to recognize the fact that Chaplin can be done live with orchestra. Interestingly enough, though, is that Chaplin never actually heard any of his compositions done live in front of a screen, because they were all written for recording and then released as a sound film. The main difficulty for Chaplin is that he couldn't read what he could play. So he was a person who composed on the piano or on the violin and had a musical associate who would write down everything that he was playing. And from there, assigning them to orchestrators, or they would orchestrate it themselves. An orchestrator is the person who takes the short sketch of what Chaplin wrote and orchestrate it for full orchestra. Chaplin relied heavily on his quote-unquote musical associates. People like David Raxon, Eddie Powell, Alfred Newman, Max Terre, Arthur Johnson. But he was very precise. When it came time to record the score that he had written, he made changes during the recording session every minute. He's like, no, I want the oboe to play the solo, not the flute. Let's leave out the basses here because it's too heavy. You know, the timpani, you know, should be playing here. You know, let's add some notes here, and which, you know, for me as a restorer was great because it was the player's individual parts that told me specifically what Chaplin wanted, not the full scores. I found music on the back of restaurant menus, on the back of laundry receipts, of pieces of scraps of paper that people would just find because they just needed to write something down quickly and play it. I think it's very much metaphorically like he made films. He would just do things over and over and over until he heard it how he heard it in his head. Chaplin's first score for full orchestra was City Lights, 1931. It was from that point on that he realized that he loved composing for his own films. And I think that he probably felt as though he was ready for the task because from the mid-20s, he was becoming increasingly involved with the music, the compilation scores of his films, and also being the composer of other songs and having his own music publishing company of his own musical work, probably gave him the confidence that he could probably write an entire film score. City Lights, being his first composition, was a kind of a small band, really. It was kind of a dance band. He had been working with other performing groups, such as Abe Lyman's orchestra, which he recorded 2 songs with. And I think he based his compositional style on what he knew before City Lights, in terms of the type of colors and orchestration. It had that intimacy and that sort of dance band feel to it, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to restore City Lights in the original way, in terms of only using maximum about 31, 32, 33 players, because that's really the original size. Because otherwise, if you use a big orchestra, it gets overwhelmingly symphonic, and it is not a symphonic piece. I find the music to be a much more intimate portrayal of the tramp character. This is a man who knew his character. He built this character, I mean, from nothing to what it is. And he did the same thing musically. But I think the most interesting parts of the City Lights composition is the personal nature of the composition itself, which is one of the reasons that there's so many violin solos in City Lights. It's not Charlie himself playing the solos, but it might as well be. You can hear his affectations. One of the things that's the most easily recognizable in Chaplin's music in terms of film is the way he treated comedy musically. And I think that stems from his days with the Fred Karno Company, which is the English vaudevillian troupe where he perfected his pantomime technique. And when he worked with the Fred Karno Company, there was always a small orchestra that accompanied his work there. And I think that had a big influence on him on how he should treat comedy musically. And that is by not playing particularly funny music for comedy. It's much funnier if you actually have some music that is elegant and that is graceful and that is really delicate. The part in City Lights, for example, when he sees a man smoking a cigar, the rich man eventually just tosses it in the street. So another hobo starts to come up and is about to pick it up. Chaplin comes up to him out of this rich man's car and literally pushes the guy over and then picks up the cigar and starts smoking it. And the music there is very elegant. That's just a typical example of how Chaplin looks at elegance in comedy. Musically, it's a masterpiece. The end of City Lights would not be nearly as successful without that music. It's devastating. I remember conducting City Lights for the very first time, and I was watching the screen, and I was realizing that I can't look at the screen anymore because I'm actually going to lose my faculties. You know, I have to concentrate because the ending's got to be, but my God, it's so pretty. And that could have only been written by Chaplin. Five years later, he did Modern Times, which was the biggest score of all, which was for 65 musicians. An incredibly detailed work, and I must say, the most fun to conduct because it's just unbelievably hard. So I enjoy it. When you see Modern Times, it's a great recording for the time, 1936, but you're actually only hearing probably about 70% of actually what's on paper and what they actually were playing. Because obviously period microphones at that time weren't able to pick up all the colors that are involved. He made a giant leap to really a big sound with lots of thumping noises, but in the Chaplin manner. He wanted, obviously, hence the title Modern Times, the industrial age kind of symphonic piece. David Raksin, when I was restoring Modern Times, told me many stories about being fired and rehired by Chaplin during Modern Times. But even David Raksin himself told me, he said that, you know, this is what Charlie came up with as a germinal sound, but Chaplin said, and now we need to really make that work. I think he learned probably a lot in orchestration going from City Lights to Modern Times, because the Modern Times Orchestra is literally double what the City Lights Orchestra was originally. Just after the main title, you have this, which is the sound of the sheep coming up, and then he transposes the sheep with workers. Then there's a trumpet fanfare, and then there's this simple little line, like that. But there's so many things happening around this really simple figure, which I think is very symbolic of the tramp himself, because it's really a simple figure in the midst of all this chaos. And the colors, the marimbas, the castanets, all these instruments coming into play like a big gear motion that's just revolving is actually quite inventive. After that, of course, Modern Times being his last silent film, he started composing works for his new films in sound, being The Great Dictator first. But then, 2 years later, before Monsieur Verdoux, he started composing for his older films that he would re-release, starting in 1942 with The Gold Rush. When Chaplin made the original silent version of The Gold Rush in 1925, that was a compilation score that existed. In 1942, he wanted to make a sound version of a sort of more modern version of The Gold Rush.
Big Jim was the noble type.
Where he would narrate over the entire picture and get rid of the intertitles, and to serve as the bed, essentially, of music behind it. He composed the entire score. So in the mid-1990s, the Chaplins had the idea of commissioning Kevin Brownlow and David Gill of Photoplay Productions to recreate the silent version from the existing materials. And I adapted the 1942 music to this silent version. The idea was to adapt that music, stretch it out, put it in the right places, make a narrative out of it, and do it as a live performance with orchestra on screen. Charlie wrote music for everything. He's very descriptive. Some people call it Mickey Mousing. I hate that term. I don't think it's really Mickey Mousing at all. Debussy himself called Chaplin to his face, "You're not really a comedian, you're a dancer." This is very important, I think, very significant, because musically, he writes to dance. And every turn of the head, every drop of a hat, every time he sits, stands, eyebrows, all have musical elements, which makes it one of the most difficult things to conduct in silent film as well. Chaplin was really interested in orchestral color. Again, you have to think that he's writing on a piano, but he's thinking in terms of orchestral sound. So like when he's working his way towards the cabin in this blizzard, there's a big storm sequence and all these different things are happening. The winds are going like that. The horns are making sort of a call of the wild. And he knocks on the door, and then all of a sudden everybody, the whole orchestra together, all 45, 50 musicians, do this big glissando, which means to slide down with the snow that falls on his head. And then Black Larson turns, and then Chaplin gets up, beep, 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 da, 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 and then Black Larson back inside, beep, beep, seriously, it's complete dialogue. The fact that Chaplin put a narration over the sound version is actually superfluous in a way, because the music completely does everything. And the Gold Rush, unlike other scores, it utilizes perhaps more quotations from other composers of music that was important to him, and I think that probably came from the original compilation score. You hear the flight of the bumblebee when Black Larson tells him to get out of the cabin, and he's running against the wind. And that's when we hear Flight of the Bumblebee. And then we hear it at the end when the cabin is tilted and they're obviously trying to save themselves. Like the use of Tchaikovsky when he's dancing with Georgia for the first time. And the biggest quotation, of course, is the Brahms Romance in F. In the grand scale of Brahms, how he knew about this one little piece, I don't know, but it's extremely beautiful. When the strings have this sort of chorale, that figure that's the Brahms. And really, it's really for piano, but he writes it for strings, of course, because Chaplin loved writing for strings, being a string player. The restoration of the Gold Rush had a little element of everything that I find interesting in restoring all the films for Chaplin. There is an aspect of trying to disseminate what I'm actually hearing in the original optical track recording to try to be able to recreate that live. During the hoedown sequence, when these two old Civil War veterans were dancing, there was this sound I couldn't quite identify as to what that was. It was a percussion instrument I couldn't quite figure out, but it was something that just sounded like sticks. And I was looking at the part, and I noticed that there was just these two little letters that said SP on it. And I thought, SP? I didn't know what it's not. I thought maybe it was SD for snare drum, but it's not. It was definitely a P. And I realized it was a spoon player. So this guy was playing the spoon. My job was to restore the score to make it sound as close to how Chaplin heard it in the studio, and that's very difficult in terms of, for a couple reasons. One is that obviously you try to gather all the information from the player's parts, put them together to try to recreate that sound, but also the playing practices in 1942, 1936 are completely different as how they are now. So a lot of passages, like in the Gold Rush, for example, between notes, they would literally not lift their finger in between two notes. They'd be dee da, da 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 dee da 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 yum, like that. That's not written. That's just what you do. But to a modern player, that is not what you do. Of course, you play exactly how it's written. So I had to write in the performance practices of the 1930s into the score. It's a period piece. Chaplin is period music that needs to be played from the period. In 1959 is when he really began composing full-time until the end of his life. He wrote for the Chaplin Review, which is made up of A Dog's Life, Shoulder Arms, and The Pilgrim. And then he also wrote for the shorts, Payday, Sunnyside, Day's Pleasure, Idle Class. And of course, the other features that he wrote for was the Circus, as well as The Kid, which is one of the last scores he wrote. What keeps on regenerating interest for me in doing these Chaplin restorations are the live performances. Because sometimes I'll be conducting a pass and we have just a little pause in a Chaplin score, and you can hear these little tiny giggles, you know, from behind for kids who've never seen Chaplin before. And you just think, this is why I spent 14 months. This is why I spent an entire day doing 15, 20 seconds worth of restoration for moments like that. There's nothing else like it in the world. Certainly, Chaplin films speak to us universally. It speaks to us through music, it speaks to us through visual means, obviously, and through the writing. When you watch a Chaplin film, you get so much more closer to that character through these artistic means. And whether or not you're watching it at home or in a cinema or in a live performance, you come away feeling closer to humanity in a way. I mean, how can you not be there with him?